My best friend disappeared in 1988. I've just found him inside by the_white mare. When I met Blake, my life changed. I'd never had a real friend until I met him. Even in kindergarten, I'd be that weird kid who'd spend recess on his own in the corner. It was in the summer of 1993. Blake's family moved in a few streets down from us. His mother, Lilibet, determined to worm her way into the country club, knocked on the door of the largest house in the suburb and presented my mum with a fresh beach cobbler. They too were inseparable from that day forth. Every time Lilibeth would come around for a wine in the evening with my mother, she'd bring Blake along. I never knew what his father worked as, but I did know that he was only ever around on weekends. I hit it off with Blake instantly. We'd spend long summer evenings upsetting wasps' nests and drinking Hawaiian punch while our mothers kept a loose eye on us from the porch. My backyard doesn't really end. Instead, it leads into the green blanket of Jefferson National Forest. Blake and I would spend hours playing in the maze of trees, building forts and sword fighting with sticks. We'd dare each other further and further into the woods, but eventually one of us would always chicken out before we went too deep. Usually me, to be honest. Blake was my best friend for 5 years. We'd hung out every day, even after our parents had a major falling out. I suppose we both knew that we had no one else to fill our time with. He went missing on a sticky summer day in 1998. His mother had begrudgingly dropped him off at our house, my house. My mother asked Blake about his day before we went exploring. As we put it, into the forest we went. Once we were far enough from my house, Blake took out the flip knife he had stolen from his father, and we played with it for a while, taking turns doing the slowest finger fillet imaginable and using it to sharpen twigs into arrows. It was while we were playing this stupid knife game that I managed to stab myself through my middle finger. I cursed and grimaced and tried not to cry in front of Blake. I slumped onto a rotting, moss-covered log and nursed my mutilated finger. For some reason I thought blowing on it would help. Blake made an unhelpful joke before picking the knife up and setting it next to me. I told him I was fine, and he started to list off some facts he knew about tetanus. I shoved him off the log, and we both laughed. Blake got up, brushing the leaves off him, and told me he'd had a great idea. He said that while we had the knife, we should carve our names into a tree. That way, anyone who sees the message will know that Blake and Robbie are best friends. I told him it was a great idea, and he should pick out the sturdiest tree he can find, while I go get a plaster. Blake began his expedition, and I walked back to the house, holding my still bleeding finger in an old tissue. I didn't realize how close we were to my house until it quickly came into view, and I hope my mother hadn't heard me swearing. She was lying back on a deck chair, reading a gossip magazine, and sipping from a glass of white wine. She jumped up as soon as she noticed my hand. Soon after, my finger was lathered in Germaline and wrapped in a band-aid. I lied and I told my mother I'd cut it on a particularly sharp stone. She seemed to buy it, or at least I thought she did. She told me to be more careful and sent me on my way. Shaking her head and muttering something about me being reckless, I wandered back into the woods to look for Blake. I stumbled across the old fallen tree I'd been using as a bench, which lay just out of view of my house. I looked around but didn't see Blake. I called his name and got no reply. I started to meander around, worrying that Blake could jump out at me at any second. He was always like that, playing tricks on me. Once he left his grandmother's old doll that he knew I hated in my bedroom after a sleepover. He still wishes that he'd been there to see my reaction. I'm wandering between the trees, further from my garden and deeper into the unrelinquished forest. Something catches my eye. A metal glint, a sparkle. I turn to see an old oak tree, its limbs tangled and broken like a car crash victim. It was the oldest tree on the property, as far as we knew. It lay right on the invisible boundary where our land ended and the administration of the United States Forest Service began. I begged my father to let me build a treehouse on its branches when I was younger, but the answer was forever no. I took a step closer. I saw what had caught my eye. Blake's flip knife was sticking out of the bark, around her shoulder height. I looked at it, puzzled, and grabbed the handle. With some effort, I managed to pull it out. Blake must have lodged it deep. I felt the weight of my hand, trying to balance it on my index finger. Blake had cleaned my blood off the blade. I guess he picked the old oak tree to carve our names and our message into. I pocketed the knife and looked around. No sign of Blake, and I still wasn't convinced that he wasn't just hiding behind a bush somewhere ready to pounce as I walked past. I called his name again. No reply. Only sound I could hear was the wind echoing between the wooden mesh entangled in the branches as worry began to set in. I heard my mother call us. Pizza was ready, apparently. All I had eaten for that day was a stick of apple-flavored chewing gum that I had accidentally swallowed, so pizza was an alluring mistress. I looked around and spoke in no particular direction, saying, "Come on, Blake, Mom made pizza. Homemade this time. None of that frozen crap." I was sure that he'd hear me and come running out, eventually, but I was wrong. I made my way out of the forest and back towards the house. "Where's Blake?" my mother asked as I sat down at the picnic table. He's around somewhere," I replied. "I reckon he's trying to prank me. He'll come crawling out of his hiding spot as soon as he smells this." We began to laugh and we began to eat. By the time we'd finished, Blake's portion was still lying cold on his paper plate, now congealed in grease. Mum was beginning to worry. She was like Blake's second mother, and practically was his mother when his parents were going through their divorce. As soon as I finished, she sent me back out into the forest to look for him. This time she came with. Half an hour later, there was no sign. My mother made me walk her through our entire afternoon. I confessed that we'd been playing with a knife. I immediately felt like I shouldn't have. She berated me about safety, but I stopped suddenly as she began to think of what could have happened to Blake. She didn't tell me. Not wanting to upset me, but I could tell she was thinking. What if Blake had cut himself? Or what if he'd been running knife in hand and tripped on a root? My mother called Lilibet soon after. She arrived before the hour's end and started a screaming match with my mum as soon as she burst through the door. Something about losing her sweet baby boy, I wasn't sure though. I had my hands over my ears for most of it. The police came next. They assured us since he'd only been gone for a little bit more than an hour, there should be nothing to worry about. He's probably just sitting by a tree, nursing a twisted ankle. Lilibet filed a missing persons report just after sundown. The rest of the day was a hectic search. Eventually my mother told me to go back inside and go to bed. I protested, wanting to be the one to find him, but eventually relented. She led me back to the house and tucked me into bed before she rejoined Lilibet. I managed to fall asleep, weariness winning the battle against worry. I was woken up by talking just outside my bedroom window. I checked the time. 6:02 a.m. I rolled out of bed and went to my window to peer outside. There was a group of people congregated in the garden. A search party. A few carried torches, although it was already bright enough to see clearly. I recognized some of the men from around town. Mr. Hall, my geography teacher. He gave me a sympathetic wave and went back to listening to the police officer, who was organizing the group into small parties. Soon thereafter, they set into the woods. By the time I got up, Blake had been gone for 15 hours. It's a myth that you have to wait 24 hours to file a missing persons report, really. You should do it as soon as their absence becomes suspicious. Some law enforcement do suggest waiting 24 hours, but that's just an advisory, or a police's way of saying, "Ma'am, could it be that your husband is just blacked out drunk in a ditch somewhere?" That day the search party found nothing. Not a piece of cloth, not a lost shoe. There was no trace of Blake at all. The local police dog brought in a sniffer dog, which were equally ineffective. Searchers began to pitter-patter out after 3 weeks. Local law enforcement explained that there was simply nothing more they could do. Still, people didn't give up hope. Lilibet would spend hours on her own, wandering through the woods, looking for her son. She'd often turn up at our house late at night, looking for a place to stay so she could resume the search as soon as her tired body allowed her. It was a wonder that she never got lost herself. Police suspicion immediately fell on my father, even though he was working at the time of the disappearance. He had a criminal record from his teenage years, but nothing major. But they used it as a rope to tie his noose. As the sheriff kept repeating that they had no new information, the townsfolk became increasingly agitated. They tried desperately to use my father as a scapegoat, a patsy, but there was nothing. No evidence that Blake had even left my backyard, let alone for a murder. My father avoided jail, but not the death of his reputation. My father lost his job. Although he was never convicted, the stigma of being the lead suspect in a missing child case was not good for a children's abundant. He couldn't find work anywhere in town. Months had passed now since Blake's disappearance, and I was back to being friendless, heavily bullied at school. I'd still walk home with Blake every day, though. His missing posters lined every lamppost from school to my house. My mother began working again. Being able to return to her position at a local women's college, it was enough to keep our family afloat. but not my parents' marriage. Their divorce was finalized on Millennium Eve. I knew it was coming, although I had enjoyed ignoring the signs. My father spent most of 1999 drunk at home. High school was a nightmare, but at least it gave me a sense of normalcy. I'd like to think I was a good student. Not that it mattered. I had to drop out of college in 2008 to care for my mother. She passed away from lung cancer in 2009, leaving me alone with the family home and more debt than it'd be worth in a decade. I lost contact with my father after my mother's funeral. Last I knew, he was living in a trailer park near the coast. I should have sold the house. Anyone in my family I still talk to told me that. The place was far too big for one person. Too hollow. I should have sold it, but I didn't. Buried in the walls of their house were memories of my happy childhood, and that was priceless. I didn't have to sell those. I didn't have to sell almost every item of furniture, every piece of jewelry, and every last possession. I had to sell them just to keep my head above the water. And worst of all, I had to work a retail job. My life was at a dead end. Every day was the same as its predecessor, and I will undoubtedly be the same as its successor. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, eat, drink, sleep, and wake up again the next morning. The only thing that kept me going was Lucy. She was a cashier at the small corner shop I worked at. She was a little younger than me. Her parents had kicked her out when she was 19. The art college she attended kicked her out as well. A few short years later, she ended up back here and had been in a cycle of part-time jobs ever since. We were good friends, as much as I wanted to be more. We'd go out for drinks as often as we could, sometimes catch a movie at the local art house cinema. She'd dated a few guys in the time that I'd known her, but nothing that didn't last more than a few weeks. I was comfortable with the friendship. I didn't want it to end like another month-long romance, so I just kept acting like I was content with calling her the brother she never had. If you're reading all this and thinking that it sounds unhealthy and a tad pathetic, then you're undoubtedly right. I just don't want to rock the boat. The night it happened began with me slumped across the front room sofa, gorging myself on an off-brand cheese puff and watching trash TV. I wiped the orange powder from my finger with my vest, picked up the phone and messaged Lucy. "Do you want to come over for a movie night?" Took a while for her reply. "Look out your window. It's the storm of the century." She had a point. I'd admit, it was the first big storm that had really hit us since 2016. It wasn't that bad now, but it was set to wreak havoc in the next few hours. Lucy and I lived within a 10-minute walk of each other's house. She'd usually pop over whenever she got frustrated with her housemates, which was often. "Good movie weather." I chuckled at my own message. Lucy didn't reply for a few minutes. Long enough for my show about the housewives to end and another about fishermen on steroids to begin. "Lol," she sent back. I took that as a no and set my phone back down on the coffee table. I rolled back over and went back to watching the TV on the screen. Regardless of whatever was being shown, I just switched off. I didn't realize that I hadn't fallen asleep until I was woken up. I groaned and sat up slowly, stale flavor of artificial cheese and Malibu on my breath. I sat there, listening to the rain until I decided to get up and investigate the noise that dragged me outside in a wake of my dreams. I stumbled through the living room and into the kitchen. I fumbled with the wall until my hand found the light switch, although I could tell what the problem was already. The light came on, and I saw I'd left the window wide open. The curtains had caught in the wind and knocked over a plant pot. The tiled floor was covered in dirt and bits of dead plant that I forgot to water. I sighed and begrudgingly poured myself a glass of water, trying not to get mud on my slippers. I sat down in what used to be my father's chair at the dining table. I swished the water around in my mouth and turned the kitchen light off so I could see outside. I sat back down and stared at the swaying trees at the foot of my backyard. At times like this, all I could think about was Blake. I wondered if he was still out there, somewhere. If I remembered correctly, the last theory from the county police was that he had fallen down a small cave entrance, one that they or anyone else could never find. I spat back into my cup, then shrugged my shoulders. Suddenly, the room was filled with a spectacular light, as I saw a lightning strike just beyond the tree line. It was over a split second. The thunder followed immediately. I laughed to myself, feeling sorry for all the dog owners in the neighborhood. I never had one, but Blake did for a while. Charles, I think his name was. Blake would tell me about how Charles would howl and whimper his way through every storm. I stopped laughing when I saw the glow. It was faint at first, but it got brighter. I got to my feet and leaned over the sink, pressing my forehead against the glass pane. It was definitely a dull orange glow coming from the woods. Fire was the first thing that came to my mind. Back in June, a fire was started in a camper van lot, not that far away. Burnt down a few people's livelihoods. The news reporter had said it had been started by lightning. I began opening random drawers around the torch. I found one, made sure it was working, grabbed a coat, and headed outside. I almost slipped on the wooden steps of the deck. I trudged across the garden, which had turned to mud by the storm, and continued on towards the glow. Some cover from the rain was granted as I crossed into the tree line. The beam of my torch fell over a mat of rotten leaves and twigs, a fallen log, and finally an old oak tree. The bolt of lightning had split the thing almost in half. Part of the tree was strewn, still smouldering on the ground. The smell of the charred timber overpowered the petriol. Split edges of the oak were a ring of ember. The source of the orange glow had led me. I took a step closer. Stopped sudden realization. This was the tree that Blake had intended on carving our names into. The tree where I found his flick knife sticking out of. The tree I knelt at every year on the anniversary of his disappearance to pray to Saint Anthony. Tears clouded my vision as I realized I'd lost my last connection to him. I'd confident that the rain would dampen any attempt the fire made at spreading. I sniffed and turned around to walk home. Robbie? I froze. Someone had called my name. It was almost hidden by the wind, but I was sure of it. Robbie. It was a voice I recognized. I turned around in circles, bewildered, scanning my surroundings. Robbie, please. Stared at the splintered oak tree. I found it. On unsteady feet, I stepped closer and closer, still to the scorched stump. I turned my torch onto its brightest setting and leaned over the side of the stump, flashing my beam down its center. The heartwood was hollowed out, and in the middle of the tree, encased in oak up to his shoulders, was a small child. It was Blake. "Robbie, please free me." I stared in shock and disbelief. I could tell my hands were shaking from how much the light danced around. It was Blake, but he's changed. His skin had the same color and texture as dried leaves. His eyes were milk white with a yellow tinge. His hair was a dirty mess, and his house was scrumbling. He was still wearing the same red shirt he had on him on the day of his disappearance, but it had now faded to the point of greyness. Despite all of this, I knew it was really him. I finally found him after all these years. I had him back, and he hadn't aged a day. "Blake," I whimpered. "Is it really you?" I reached out to try and hug him, but he hissed at me. I'm sure he was scared and confused like me. "Blake, please, I'm trying to get you out. Just hold on to my hand and I'll pull you out." Blake let out a long raspy "no" before saying, "Only blood can set me free." I took a cautious step back. "Blood? Blake, what are you talking about?" "Bring me blood. Bathe me in it, Robbie. Free me." We stared into each other's eyes for a long moment. Then Blake's face contorted into a sickening grin. I turned and ran straight back to my house. I fell into a glut of mud but stumbled to my feet. I clambered up my deck and fell through the glass sliding doors. I pulled the curtain shut, such force I broke a few of the rings. I tore off my sodden clothes as I ran upstairs. I collapsed onto the bed in my childhood bedroom and fumbled around with the bedside cabinet, looking for my zolpidem. I took 4 of them and turned over for a restful night. For a blissful few seconds when I woke up, I couldn't recall the events of the night before. And then it hit me. I laid in the bed until I couldn't justify it anymore. I got up and made my way downstairs. First thing I did was grab a broom and clean as best I could the dirt and broken pottery from the kitchen floor. Once it was acceptably clean, I made myself a coffee, sat down on the chair that had once turned to face the window, took a scalding sip and internally debated if I should do as I watched the trees sway in the afternoon wind. By the time the mug was empty, I decided to talk to Blake again. I made my way out of the house and onto the familiar trail, through my garden, through the woods to the oak tree, till I saw it split for Cade. I thought there was still a chance I'd dreamed it all. Any hopes of that ended when I saw Blake sturming around in the stump. He stopped moving when he saw me and smiled. "You've come back, Robbie." I want to help you, Blake," I said in a voice barely more than a whisper. "You can help me, Robbie. Bring me blood." I stared at Blake in disbelief. I didn't know what to do, what to say. Every time I looked at him, I felt this weird sense of joy. I wanted a chance to see him one last time every day for the past 18 years. And now here it was. And I was thinking about turning my back on him. I couldn't understand what was going on, but I knew what I had to do. "Why do you need blood?" I stuttered. "It would bring me back," replied Blake. "Isn't that what you want?" I looked into his blank eyes and saw compassion. It was something I hadn't felt in years. "Okay," I said. "I will help you. I will do it." Blake whispered, "Thank you, Robbie," as I turned away and went back to the house to grab my wallet, my jacket and my keys. I locked up and got in my car. I single-mindedly drove to the nearest butcher, parked on the double yellow line, and made my way to a generic corporate butcher shop. The walls were lined with cured meats and pictures of oddly happy-looking cartoon pigs. I leaned over the counter and was greeted by a barrel-shaped middle-aged man who didn't look much different from the animals he sold. "Do you sell blood?" I asked in earnest. "Blood?" replied the butcher. "Well, sure we do, but we don't get much call for it though. How much can I do you for?" I realized I wasn't exactly familiar with the blood measurement, so I told him, "I'll take a gallon." The butcher disappeared and into the back he went. He returned moments later with a plastic container covered in frost. "I'm afraid we've only have pork blood in stock, if that's alright." "Oh, sure, that's fine," I told him. "Perfect. That'll be $18. I grimaced at the thought of giving up almost 3 hours' wages for a fool's errand. And on the other hand, my social anxiety prevented me from asking him to get a smaller portion. I reluctantly paid in full and waved the portly man a goodbye. The blood had begun to thaw on my back seat, leaving a stain I knew I'd never get out. I pulled into the driveway and got out. I opened the back door, unbuckled the seatbelt, and around the container of blood. I don't know why I put a seatbelt on it. It just felt right. As I approached, I heard a dull whispering coming from Blake. He stopped once he saw me. "Hello, Robbie," he said. "I got what you wanted," I told him as I unscrewed the lid. "Thank you, Robbie. You're my best friend." I beamed a smile as I heaved the gallon of blood onto my shoulders and began pouring a torrent of it, covering Blake completely in crimson. Enough of it splashed on my clothes to make it look like I'd butchered a deer once it was empty. I sat down next to the stump and waited for Blake to be free. The blood began seeping into his flesh and the wood around him. There was a sound like a drain emptying as liquid receded. Within a minute, he was completely clean. However, I noticed his skin became noticeably looser. I stood back, expecting him to squirm out of the oak prison. Instead, his face fell and spoke in a slightly lower pitch. "I need fresh blood, Robbie. You have to bring me fresh blood, and I will be free." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Fresh blood," I stuttered. "What do you mean?" He repeated, "I need fresh blood, Robbie. Bring me fresh blood, and I'll be free." I turned and stormed off. I thought that I could help him. Thought that I was doing the right thing, but clearly I couldn't help Blake. Even now, I returned to the house and collapsed onto the sofa in a depressive heap. I felt such a strong, almost unnatural compulsion to help, but nothing I did felt like it made up for losing him. I knew it was dumb to blame myself, but at the back of my mind, I always felt responsible. It's even been tied up around my conscience since I was 12 years old. Now I could finally put those things right. I was second guessing myself. Just then, the neighbor's cat jumped on my windowsill and curled up in a sunspot next to the box plant. I stared at its furry shape and realized what I must do. Slowly I stood up from the couch and made my way to the kitchen. I grabbed the largest knife I could find from my drawer. The cat belonged to my next door neighbor. It was a grey tabby named George. The neighbor's family got it when I was just a kid. I couldn't imagine how old he must be. I grabbed him by the tail. At his age, there wasn't much more he could ask for. I brought this new offering to Blake. He seemed happier with it. With the knife, I managed to drain all the blood I could from the ginger hairball. Blake opened his mouth and stuck out a grey, cracked tongue. As the blood dripped onto his face, he was like a small child experiencing snow for the first time. I felt a warmth deep inside of me as he fed. "Is that better?" I asked. Blake replied, "I can taste life for the first time in years. Please, I need more." It was the answer I expected, an answer that I was resigned to. I had my best friend back, and I wasn't going to give him up. The next week was a blur of violence. Usually I had a lunch with Lucy, but now I'd spend my breaks driving around town searching for lost pets and strays. I'd taken to using a sharpened screwdriver. It was the most humane way. Finding would stay in the trunk until I could go home and free their blood to Blake. He told me he was growing healthier and was almost free, but it didn't seem like it. His complexion was even more sickly than when I first found him. His skin was now a dark turquoise and had a texture like leather. They looked like they were slowly falling off the flesh underneath. Seems like he had appeared all over the visible parts of his body, and they looked like they were about to burst. His arms were now free, and he used it to play rock, paper, scissors with me. This particular day I got off work and drove home with a Pomeranian wrapped in a bin liner in my backseat. I began my usual routine. Put the knife into the dock. I watched the blood spill. Blake spoke. "Why are you poisoning me?" I looked at him in shock and tried to hide the frustration in my voice as I replied. "What do you mean, Blake? I'm bringing you everything you asked for." Blake's childlike grin turned into a grimacing frown. Now his facial expression took ages to turn, as if he had to tell me each individual muscle in his face. "The blood of the animals is sour to me now, and yet you keep showering me in it. Do you want me to suffer, Robbie?" I quickly come to my own defense. No, of course not. "What do you need?" I asked, but I already knew the answer. "Human blood," whispered Robbie. Those two words directed the course of my life from then on. I spent the rest of my day tackling this morality, this quandary first. I attempted to contact a blood bank to inquire about withdrawal, but I quickly realized how tremendously stupid of an idea this was. The next thing I did was research how much blood a person could lose without dying from Google. I found out that a person could lose close to 40% of their entire volume and live. I decided that I would try to remove it from myself. It felt fitting after all. It would be my own blood that frees Blake. The next few days we'd spent preparing. I checked in on Blake regularly to see how he was doing with my blood supply. Not only was he fine, he looked more healthy and more normal than he'd ever been. He insisted, however, that going this long without blood would kill him. So I endowed to hurry up I made a homemade IV out of sewing needles, a turkey baster, and tubing from a long, dormant fish tank. I sat down on a chair, and I hoped it wouldn't hurt. I put a plastic bucket next to me, and I spent an hour sterilizing everything as best I could. I stabbed the needle into my cephalic vein and let gravity do the rest. Slowly but surely, the bucket began to fill. I sat there dizzy. I groggily pulled up the makeshift hypodermic needle out of my arm and collapsed back onto the chair. I managed to collect myself. I steadily got to my feet and looked in the bucket. There was barely any blood in it. I found a 1-liter measuring jug that I'd never used and poured it in. I'd only just filled up the brim. More than I thought, but nowhere near enough. I brought the jug to Blake, careful not to spill it. His blank eyes lit up when he saw me. I held the jug over him, his mouth hanging unexpectedly open, blood, and he began to giggle, just like he would when we were kids. His gullet filled with black clots and began to overspill, dribbling down his chin and down onto his chest. Once the glass was empty, I let it fall to the floor. He began thanking me, calling me his best friend, saying we'd never part. I felt a warmth I hadn't expected or hadn't even experienced since my mother died. Wood splintered as he pulled his other arm free. I knew what to do. I leaned in and we hugged each other. We will never part again, Robbie. I know, Blake. I will never let you go. He smelt like death, but I didn't care. He pulled me tighter and whispered in my ear, but I am still not free. I recoiled from his embrace. I should have known that he wouldn't be satiated. I had to avert my gaze from Blake. I could tell he was scowling at me. I walked back to the house, leaving Blake to calm down. I slumped onto the chair, trying to think of what I should do next. I noticed my phone was on the coffee table. The past few days had been a monofocus blur. I couldn't remember the last time I picked up my phone. I grabbed it and immediately saw Lucy had been trying to contact me. I had dozens of unread texts and missed calls from her. I've been doing my best to avoid her at work. She tried to come around yesterday. I just hid in my room and pretended to be out. I tapped on the notifications and read through the catalogued message. All had the same theme, something to do with my well-being. I lay back and decided to give her a call. The phone rang for a while before she picked up. She didn't sound as concerned as I thought she'd be, but she was happy to know I was alright. She had repeated what she'd been saying over the text, that I felt different and distant. I told her I was fine, really, and that she should come over tonight. She agreed and she would be there around 7 p.m, and then we said goodbye. I had a plan. I knew that there was no other choice, and I wanted to free Blake. I wanted to be together again, and it was what I must do. I put on my jacket and slid my knife into the pocket, and I sat and waited for Lucy. She arrived half an hour late, an impressive feat considering she only lived 10 minutes away. I could tell she knew that something was up. I didn't know what to do, so I blurted out that I'd been diagnosed with depression. It seemed to click for her that what went wrong, and she took to comforting me best she could. Lucy had always been a tree hugger. She made me try out veganism once or twice, but it never stuck. Hearing about my struggle, the first thing she said was, we should get out into nature more. She asked me if there was any place that I felt truly happy. I stifled a smile, and I told her that I knew a place. My heart beat like a tribal drum. as I led Lucy from the house. Through the garden, onto the forest. I stopped for a second, letting her walk just in front of me as we came up to the stump. A few steps later, she saw it. Blake had metamorphosized since this morning. His skin had been replaced with black mold. The only feature on his face was wide eyes and teeth, floating in an inky nothingness. He didn't look like Blake at all anymore. His red t-shirt was gone, digested into his body. Wispy tendrils protruded from all over his body and connected him to the ruined oak that rose on the other side of him. He sat comfortably within the stump, but looked like he was beginning to spill out. Lucy let out a scream that sent the crows flying from their perch. Before she could run, before she could react, before she could do anything else, I pushed her forwards until she was inches from Blake's grinning maw. I took out my pocket knife and I slit her throat. Her screams turned into a gurgle, and then they ended. Blood poured from her wound and onto Blake, who still spoke in the voice of a child. "This is it," he decreed. "Just a little more." He was still saying that by the time her neck ran dry. I maneuvered the body, trying desperately not to throw up. I cut both wrists and held her in place as the blood flowed. Suddenly Blake began to bubble. Pustules sprang up and popped all over his body. He expanded, almost entirely enveloping the stump. I stumbled back and let Lucy's body fall. Blake's eyes rolled back into his head and disappeared, along with his teeth. His body had lost all shape now. It was just a black, writhing mess. 2 hands pierced the top of the mass, and it split open like a satchel. A man began to rise from the black pile, floating in the air. A Native American man. He looked to be in his 60s, although his aura was unknowingly old. His eggs were covered in intricate symbols of red and white, and he wore a tattered animal hide shirt around his neck. With a cockade of beads and feathers, he began to speak in a language I couldn't begin to understand. I only recognized one word: Okius. He didn't even look at me. He kept rising into the sky, past the tree line and further still. I craned my neck and shielded my eyes from the evening sun. The man continued up into the sky until he came to a stop, 100 feet or so from the ground. His incantations heeded and he began to vibrate. Suddenly he exploded into a cloud of ash, which caught on the wind and flooded away. I clambered over the stump, but all the black mess had already begun to evaporate, and there was no trace of Blake. There was no sign he'd ever been there at all. There was nothing. I spent the next years on the run for a murder. My old life died with Lucy. In the past 8 years, I've written this account over a dozen times. It's my admission of guilt. Now I'm finally at peace with it. Make it what you will, and leave me unburdened. I don't know what I let into this world, but there's nothing left I can do. I love you, Blake.